For the sake of efficiency, I guess we'll start now. We've packed a lot into today. I want to thank you for coming to attend this session. I know there's lots of things that could be going on a Friday. My name is Brandon Williams. My colleague here with a very nice personal computer setup is Dr. Paul Langston. We're both historians at Community College of Aurora. And what we're going to be talking about today asks us to rethink about how we teach about discrimination and oppression in a diverse classroom. In large part, we're calling attention to what we call damage-centered instruction. By damage-centered instruction, what we mean is instruction that focuses on discrimination, marginalization, oppression of people who themselves have been historically oppressed and marginalized. And what we're proposing here isn't to back away from such instruction. That's necessary, right? And in many courses, we need to explore, racial and ethnic disparities. For, history, we need to explore the history of, slavery, apartheid, colonization, imperialism, Jim Crow laws, Northern Jim Crow, market-based discrimination. I mean, it's necessary in a multitude of disciplines that are offered at our community colleges. So we aren't arguing to back away from that. Rather, we're arguing that when educators teach about such issues, that we need to do so with a sense of intentionality, because if we only teach about people from marginalized and oppressed groups through a damage-centered lens or through a damage-centered narratives, we may be unintentionally sending a message to our students, which is different from our intent. I'll elaborate upon this further, but first I sort of wanted to expound upon the organization of our presentation. At first, I'll sort of define how this came to be in my own personal experience. I use my hands a lot for no reason. There's no rhyme or reason for my hands, so don't pay attention to them. And then my colleague here, Dr. Paul Langston, will talk about sort of things he's done to address this in his own history classes. We'll then have a breakout room for you to discuss and share out maybe either your own experience with damage-centered instruction or where it may be present in your disciplines. And then we'll sort of conclude by talking about solutions. If you can go to the next slide, Paul. This notion of damage-centered instruction originated in a 20th century world history course of mine. To those who don't know, the 20th century was by far the most murderous and deadliest century in all of human history. By far, it's not even close. And the very first reading and discussion I used to assign for my class involved a reading by historian Edwin Black on the first genocide of the 20th century. This genocide is depicted here. It's the German genocide of the Herero and Nama people of Southwest Africa in 1904. This is a genocide which very few people know about. It's a genocide which has been historically obscured. It's a genocide which very few of my students know about. And I'd say even in a room of educated participants, perhaps there are people in this forum who are not aware of this genocide. It was absolutely brutal. Tribeswomen were raped, men who defended them were killed, people were placed in rudimentary concentration and labor camps, men, women, and children were slaughtered. In other instances, the German military shot above the heads of men, women, and children to drive them into the desert so they could go to wells, but then they poisoned those wells. I mean, I don't really need to expound upon the brutality of it. I mean, people who were weak and emaciated and poisoned, just thrown body onto body alive and set on fire. It's a genocide that we just don't talk about that much. I assigned this particular article because the genocide was so obscure, but there's another very important reason why I assigned it, and that is historian Edwin Black argues that Germany, in an attempt to justify their slaughter here, their genocide here, they created a sort of racial ideology that ultimately became a part of a proto-Nazi ideology that later shaped the Holocaust. So why this article is important is he's taking two seemingly disparate events and he's drawing a linkage between them. He's drawing a nexus between them. This allows us to complicate our understandings of white supremacy and Nazi ideology, and we can see how the Third Reich's racial views were born out of imperialism. So when I assigned this article, I pat myself on the back. I said, this is important. Students are learning something very valuable. I'm revealing so much about, white supremacy and imperialism. We talked about this in class. It was the first day of class. And then afterward, the discussion had gone well. This student comes up to me, and the student was a young Black woman. And she said something that I can hear it to this day. I can picture the mental image of being there. And she said, have you ever thought about what it means to students of color when you assign this reading on the first day of class? Have you ever thought about what it means to students of color when we discuss this on the very first day of class? And I wish I could say that I responded to this student with a position that was open and amenable. I wish I could say that as a white male historian, I considered my positionality. I wish I could say that I acknowledged her bravery or her identity. Um, but I didn't. Rather, I responded with a historical defense of why I was covering this, because the historical discipline, by and large, believes this should be covered. And I replied to her with that confidence. We had a conversation. It was later hashed out through emails. Paul, if you can go to the next slide, please. And my argument was that if we don't pay attention to acts of genocide which involve people of color, historical genocides which involve people of color, then we are conditioned to not pay attention to contemporary genocides that involve people of color. We may not pay attention to what happened with the slaughter of the Rohingya in Myanmar, or what's going on with the Uyghur Muslims or China, or when we turned a blind eye to what was going on in Rwanda or Sudan, or when we're not paying attention to what's going on in Syria. So, I threw all my intellectual heft at the student because I felt as though my discipline and myself was being challenged. The student and I hashed out these conversations in further depth and detail. And I remember another class where I talked about the racial dynamics of drafting during World War I. And I talked about how racism informed some of those policies. As an example, in Southern draft boards, they would sometimes exempt people from the draft if taking a male out of the household was deemed to place an undue economic burden upon the family. But the argument among some of these Southern draft boards was that, well, blacks were accustomed to poverty, so they can be drafted more easily than whites, whereas this would be a more, tough economic hit. I got an email from that student. She said, "Why did you bring that up in class today?" And I talked about the long history of institutional racism within the US military, talked about how blood was segregated up into including World War II. During World War II, it's not uncommon for Black soldiers to have less access to military bases than German POWs. Martin Luther King during Vietnam asked why African Americans represented 12% of the population, but 25% of the casualties. There's more than this, but I responded with obstinacy. I dug in my heels, and I really wished I went about it, a different way with that student. But this conversation stayed with me, and I think really why it was is because of the inclusive excellence trainings we have at CCA, our culturally responsive pedagogy, workshops that we have at CCA. And I would argue that it turned me from a defensive historian into a reflexive practitioner, at least aspiring to be a reflexive practitioner. So then I started to ask, what's going on in my classroom? I can't shy away from teaching this, but what is it about teaching this issues, or maybe I could do it in a more proper way? And I started to scour academic journals from history articles, didn't really find anything. Historians discussed, the need to discuss it. They didn't discuss how. So then I brought these ideas to anyone who would listen at CCA. And one of my colleagues at CCA, who was heavily involved in inclusive excellence work, he said, have you ever considered what your field looks like? Have you ever considered who produces the scholarship in your field? Have you ever considered who is doing the bulk of the historical instruction in your field? And although I always knew what my discipline looked like, it was the realization of it in this context that created an epiphany of sorts, because a majority of historians are white, a majority of historians are white males. They shape the disciplinary norms. They're the gatekeepers in our discipline. Our panels are mostly white. Our faculty at universities nationwide are mostly white. So perhaps because of the field's whiteness, we never had to consider what it was like to be on the other side of historical instruction. I, as a white male historian, have never had to consider what it's like being a student of color on the other side when we're talking about the slave trade and enslavers palpating the breasts and hips of enslaved women to determine their reproductive ability. I could never understand the emotion of a Jewish student learning about the execution of Jews and the Holocaust by bullets and how that was sometimes treated with a carnival-esque atmosphere. I could never understand the anger of a gay student learning about America's slow and homophobic response to the AIDS epidemic. So then that raised the question, have I ever considered the emotion that students from historically marginalized and oppressed identities experience on the other side? I mean, this is common to see in the historical practice. I remember a historian I was with at a university in Virginia, I won't name what it is, It was named after James Madison. I don't know if that narrows it down. But this historian, he had a concern. He said, I'm talking about slavery, and this one black student shut down. And the one thing he said is, why isn't that student paying attention? He needs to hear this. And if you consider the positionality of that statement, a white historian talking about a black student saying, you need to hear this, it's important for me to tell this to you, and you need to respond to it in this prescribed way. It's not even considering the student's lived experience. It's not considering the emotionality of why that student may be shutting down. So I consulted, I eventually found scholarship, and it was by Indigenous scholar Eve Tuck. She coined the idea of damage-centered research. And what she argued was that social science researchers, in an attempt to expose how systems of oppression create brokenness and despair, by extension have a tendency, a penchant to portray the people enmeshed within these discriminatory systems as similarly broken, as similarly filled with despair. And she said, damage cannot be the only way we talk about ourselves. So I've adapted her term to call this damage-centered instruction. If students are in an environment like now, which has a rise of white extremism and hate groups, and they come into a classroom that shows racism and white supremacy in the historical past, and that's the only narrative they're exposed to, they can feel bombarded on all sides. So before I move this over to Paul, I do want to clarify that when we talk about this, it's not saying we should shy away from it. It's not saying that we need to engage in censorship or that we should shy away from things that are unnerving, disquieting, or harsh, or cruel, or uncomfortable. Rather, what this means is that we should be mindful of the dangers of only teaching the danger, and that if we are teaching about that, we need to do so with more intentionality. So I hope that provides a clear definition of the
Just a
problem.
minute. It has.
I'll shift it over to Paul.
Thank you. Did we have a question? Guess not.
Yeah,
okay, I just heard a noise. Anyway, so yes, so I had a similar experience too in U.S. history, and I won't go into it as depth. But I was trying to diversify my course years ago, and I had a student at the end of one class just say something along the lines of, I can't take this anymore. And she was a great student, very engaged, and I was kind of surprised. So I approached her and we talked about it. And once we talked about it, it makes sense. I was simply overwhelming her with this damage-centered narrative. And again, I'll admit, years back when I attempted to diversify my courses, the first thing I did was like, oh, let's just throw out some primary documents here and there. Let's try to expand on a few of the topics I see in the textbook. But those were often from that damage center point of view. And again, I should have been seeking out a more balanced and representative story. I also should have sat down and asked myself, what is the goal? What is the point of this assignment activity today? Or what impact would this have on my students, like Brandon was saying? Again, questions we should all ask in our classes. And again, focusing on too much of a damage-centered instruction creates inequity in the classroom. Again, you're creating obstacles. Students might disconnect from the class, and that compromises their chance to succeed. The best comparison I came up with was comparing it to politics these past few years. A lot of us probably got a lot of negativity from politics, and we're just like, okay, I'm checking out, I'm done. If you check out on the news for a few weeks, that's fine. It's probably healthy. However, if one of your students checks out of the class for a couple of weeks, again, you are compromising the success of those students. You're putting them at a disadvantage. And again, yes, we are just two historians talking about this, but this applies to all fields: geography, political science, English, anthropology, so on and so forth. So what I would suggest is taking a deeper look at your courses and materials and see what kind of damage-centered narrative may be appearing and to what extent. Now, some solutions, again, ones that came to mind for me. Discuss this with your class. Again, discuss the damage-centered narrative. This is nothing new to them. They have experienced this throughout their time in school. They're not going to be shocked or surprised if you say that. They're going to probably be like, yeah, I knew that. In my classes, we talk about the issues, like Brandon had mentioned, of a field dominated by the writings of white male historians. Again, why is all this information often presented in this damage-centered way? Another thing I do in my class is the book you see here. We discussed this book briefly, Mistaking Africa. The book focuses on issues with how white people view Africa, which is unfortunately from this damage center point of view, disease, poverty, suffering, and all that. And again, it points out that it's just obviously leaving out so much. Again, the rich diversity of cultures, holidays, families, celebrations, discoveries. I mean, the list goes on and on. And so you can use something like this as an example to talk about how this damage-centered narrative is impacting the field. And again, like I said, talk to your students. Every time I've done this, they've been really engaged in it. They've been really, they really want to voice their opinions because it's something they can relate to, it's something they can understand. Something else you can do is, again, move away from texts that focus on that traditional narrative. Open educational resources, again, using those to build or modify your course. Not only are OER texts more equitable, but there's an abundance of sources out there. So you can either, like I said, build or simply modify your class. And again, it doesn't necessarily have to be textbooks. You have a lot of open access material regarding documents, poetry, writings, whatever. Again, on the bottom right here, I have one of the examples that's had a really positive impact the past few semesters. Many of you, I guess historians, may have already used it, but it's Jordan Anderson writing his former enslaver in 1865. So again, this is the United States. This is immediately after the Civil War. And again, the traditional narrative would have been Jim Crow, slavery by another name, the traps that African Americans are falling into. And again, it's important to address those. But again, this document still addresses those issues, still addresses what's going on, but in a totally different light. And not to read, I'm not going to make you all read the document, but what it is, it's a letter from Anderson to his former enslaver, like it said, where his enslaver had written him and said, hey, you want to come back? We could use you. And what you see here is the power balance swapped. Well, now Anderson has the power in this relationship, and it's a very sarcastic, very read between the line letter of, oh, I hope you're doing okay, although I remembered you shot at me a couple of times, and if you want to pay me for all my back pay and all of that. And again, it presents what's going on, but I've never had a document during this period that has my class like laughing and entertained because he's really just making this guy look like a fool. So again, look for any types of sources like that that can, again, still teach the important information, but kind of flip it on its head as well. Finally, again, empower your students. This is a great and equitable solution that solves a lot of this. So one way would be to survey them. Once I was made aware of this issue, again, the first thing I started doing was asking my students. I was giving them more directed questions about certain activities and the class as a whole. Again, not only does this help you adjust your course to better fit your students' needs, but again, it empowers them. And it's kind of doubling up on increasing student success here because, again, you're creating a course and using course materials that they appreciate and understand and like more. But again, you're also showing their voice matters in the class as well. And again, if you've spent time building those relationships and building that trust with your students, they'll give you honest feedback. And again, over the course of semesters, you can learn what works, what doesn't work, and modify your classes accordingly. And the last thing you could do is just simply turn the class and learning over to them, whether it's the flipped classroom or anything like that. Give your students a topic, see where they take it. I mean, you'll be surprised, you'll be fascinated by what do they focus on and why. So again, these are just a few quick suggestions of options you have here. So what we want to spend some time on, again, is breakout rooms. Put you all in breakout rooms, and again, keeping in mind what you have just learned about regarding damage center instructions, answer these questions. And I will put these questions in chat. I guess I better do it now before I send you off into breakout rooms.
Rookie mistake, Paul.
I know, there's always something. But let's see, am I creating the, oh, here, let me stop sharing. And we'll create breakout rooms.
Let me know if you don't have that option because I do across the bottom.
I was about to say, it's not where it's supposed to be. Could you please create breakout rooms for us?
Sure. We've got 111 participants.
Holy cow. I'm glad I didn't know that 10 minutes ago. We'll just say 4 or 5 per group. It doesn't matter. I'd rather have people talking than 20
Okay.
people per group. And then we'll do
Okay.
this for about 10 minutes, and then we'll come back and have a quick share out. And then unfortunately, we'll already be out of time.
All right, I'm going to do about 20 rooms then. I think that'll probably balance out fairly well.
2 rooms of 55.
That'll be a conversation.
That is not an engaging group.
All right. And we're just going to automatically assign rooms. So here we go. Okay. And Paul, I'm going to copy and paste your questions and do that as I have an option here to broadcast message to all. So I'm going to copy those questions and broadcast them to everybody.
Do you mind if I stay in this room to prepare for the conclusion?
Oh, please feel free.
All right.
You do what you feel you need to do. Actually, I'm fascinated to listen to this. I'm coming off of this having done a one of our coworkers has us all sign up for an anti-racism newsletter, and then once a month we do a meeting and sort of discuss what's come up out of that. And I did that yesterday, and coming into this today is really eye-opening to me.
Yeah, it's I would say it's nothing really. I don't know how to describe it. Like, I found it as an epiphany, you know, and others have, but it's also, you know, there's been things in other disciplines where, you know, they've emphasized the idea of stressing agency about, you know, people enmeshed within these systems of subjugation. But, you know, often when we were talking about that, all these academics would use the word agency, 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 agency. But it's like, have you ever truly expounded upon why this is truly important? And not only why it's important in terms of, you know, the subject, but also the students in the classroom. So that's where I think it's important. And that scholar I mentioned, Eve Tuck, I think it's called An Open Letter About Damage Centered Research or something like that. I could send it to you. And she frames it remarkably well.
Trying to see, there are, by the way, several people who either appeared, I was trying to see if we are in a breakout room or if there are folks who've just not done that. But there are several folks who are in the space with us, just so you're aware of it.
All right.
Again, none of us have broken out in profanities, so I think we're good. But
I'll put the hyperlink of her article in the chat.
And so you tell me when you want me to, I can broadcast a message to all when you want to give them a 1 minute or 30 seconds or whatever.
All right.
And then close the rooms.
Maybe around like 10:44, 10:45.
Okay.
That seems like an oddly specific time.
No worries. No worries. Just to play with the settings here, I'm going to try and bounce and see if I can join any of these rooms or how that works. I'm just testing.
Right. So everyone here is in a purgatory because they didn't join a breakout room or something?
They are answering emails. We will assume we are all multitasking, right?
All right. This whole year's been purgatory, so.
One of my favorite podcasts termed it Morch. It's just more March.
Eternal March.
Uh-huh. Well, it's funny. Those particular performers happened to have been on the cruise that I was on at the beginning of March of 2020. And we all came back into, oh, you should quarantine for 2 weeks to, oh, everybody's in lockdown.
Oh, geez.
It was.
Oh man, that must be etched in your memory.
Yes, it's very odd to have had this great and wonderful experience to come back to, okay, well, this is weird.
So we apparently have someone who wrote that no one is in my room except someone who's teaching a class.
Oh no. Let's see if I can see. All right. Well, I have. Oh, okay. There's a couple of small.
Yeah. Well, we'll be coming back in a couple minutes anyways. So.
Yeah. And I show Paul in a breakout room. That's interesting.
I would imagine the share out is gonna take they always take longer, which is good.
Yes, absolutely.
A bad thing. But they're always longer than you assume. And again, which is good. So maybe like 10:43, I guess.
And fair warning, because I am moderating meetings every hour all week, all day, I will have to leave at probably 11:02, and starting the next meeting may shut this one down. So I will try and set you as a host, but I suspect it's when I start the next one, this will have to close.
So just, I mean, be done by 11, essentially.
If you can, yes, please.
Do you have any like Academy Awards music to play? Like,
oh, that's funny. What just ran through my mind was probably the Price is Right, Come On Down music. That's not what we meant. Oh, goodness. My brain is a little strange.
I only acknowledge Bob Barker Price is Right, not Drew Carey Price is Right.
Yeah. Drew Carey is awesome in other contexts, but Price is Right might not be it. Yeah, there's quite a few smaller rooms. I think for future reference, we're going to bump that number a little higher. We've got several that have 4 people listed, but only 2 people who've actually entered the room.
All right. Yeah, so maybe send a thing to bring everyone back in 60 seconds, I guess.
Okay.
And Dawn, I assume you can hear me. You had a really good question. That's something that, quite honestly, I think we need to do more on. You know, and in my classes, it just begins with an honest and an open conversation. I let students know when we're covering pretty harsh terrain. So just that openness and transparency on that end. And then, I mean, we obviously have the care report system, which I'm sure is transposed to other community colleges. But I mean, I largely view it as creating those supports internally within class, because I often find that students will be more candid with me than maybe another, you know, environment. In terms of external safety nets, that's honestly something which I need to be made more aware of. And something I need to look into. You've asked a question which reveals my blind spot and something I definitely need to look into.
Yeah, I went into a course recently where the instructor did not, I mean, she was well-intentioned, right? But boy, did it dissolve to lots of sidebar conversations and totally derail the experience. You know, not that the work doesn't need to be done or addressed, but it is creating those safety nets, right? Of that moment you pause, a moment we ask questions, and how does somebody create a safety net for themselves? You know, not everybody has that skill set, right? So again, the time question comes into play. How much time of the day do you have to help people create their own safety nets and still engage in the work that needs to be done?
That's a great question. And it, like I said, it shows the work that needs to be done. because I mean, sometimes there may be students who may not be comfortable, sharing that with me. So it's like providing
Absolutely.
those external supports.
I was, sorry, I don't want to interrupt at all. I was having this conversation yesterday, though, about the fact that as a white woman, when I was in a situation where I was being harassed, I had the agency to be able to speak up loudly and angrily. But a woman of color may not have that ability.
Yes.
Welcome back, everyone. I think everyone is back.
We've got about 10 seconds left
10
before
seconds.
the
Okay,
last of the rooms close down.
Okay, I will wait. So many we can't count anymore.
You have to realize too, there's so many levels to this in this particular group. It was a mixed group, but it was people who were white that had been silenced because of trauma in their lives, and they didn't have a voice. And that's just like, it's a complex issue. There's no one size fits all.
Exactly.
But we have to create as best of a process as we can.
And that's honestly what you brought up is something that I'll bring forward to our Dean of Students, because it's admittedly a blind spot, something that I need to be more aware of.
You know, it's funny, this is going to sound really stupid, and if you watch it, you'll probably think it's really stupid initially, but there's a movie called The Good Place. It's a TV series. It's something I think everybody should watch just to get some basic rudimentary understanding of the complexities of all these topics. It's just, it tends to be a safe place for most people to look at it. Not probably for every audience, but it's allows there to be some humor in the process as well, when we tend to get so serious about all of this and so hypersensitive to everything. Anyway, throw that out as if you get sick like I did this week and you just have to binge watch something, there you go.
All right.
Welcome back, everyone. So what we want to do for about 10 minutes, because we're running out of time, is just kind of do a share out and see if anyone wants to talk about what their group talked about. And so we can just start with this first question of where might this narrative appear in your courses, or your own experiences as a student, or heck, we can just do either question. So does anyone want to share what they talked about in their group?
I think someone raised their hand in the chat. And Paul, just so you know, this thing ends at like 11. There's a chance where it'll just be shut down at like 11 or 11:01.
We'll go for about 8 minutes, and then we'll do a close down, and that's it. So we'll go to 55. So sorry if we have to cut anyone off. So anyone have any comments or share? Okay, how do we do this share at hands? You can just unmute and talk.
I'll unmute. This is Courtney Avant from Community College of Denver. I was paired with Rod Alexander from Northwestern, and he's in the cybersecurity program, and I teach lit. But we had a great conversation about just the damage narrative that appears, or just the way that, like, I teach women's lit, and part of that is teaching suffrage, and you can teach it as just focusing on, a lot of people think of suffrage as Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And I think many people would think it's okay to focus on that, but suffrage, which was a much longer movement, and it included women of color in it. And so I've worked really hard to, in my class, expand that unit so it includes those different contributions, and doesn't just focus on sort of the most visible figures. And it was really interesting, Rod and I were talking about cybersecurity, and we kind of hit on this idea that cybersecurity can tend to be a very white male field. And so how do you pull other people into it, and particularly women? And we talked about the damage narrative that seems to exist in this field, is all of the stories out there about how women are not welcome in that field, and have had bad experiences in the field. And while that might be true, how do we counter that with experiences of women who have been successful in the field, and who have had good experiences in the field and who are developing careers in the field. So it was really just a great conversation with Rod. And Rod, if you want to chime in, I don't want to talk too much.
I agree with what you're saying. We definitely had a good conversation.
Excellent. And yeah, that is something, again, not to bring it back to history, but again, filling in those historical gaps. So again, when we're looking at people of color, Native Americans don't show up in the 1500s and then vanish from the historical record. Again, I was talking the other day about, again, the long civil rights movement, again, looking at late 1800s all the way to the 1950s. The civil rights movement didn't just magically pop up. You had African Americans, Asian Americans, Native Americans, Latinx, immigrants, so on and on, fighting this resistance the entire time, but it only pops up. And again, pops up's a bad word because that's what it's doing in history classes and other classes. So yeah, I think that's a great point. Who else has a comment?
Maybe we could use the positive stories we hear at Black History Month, Women's History Month, and use those to illuminate the contributions. I work in business law and I teach paralegals, and so we can indicate that the experience has not all been negative, that there have been some role models that have changed the law, changed business, etc. So that may be a resource that wouldn't take too much research.
Yeah, and we were talking about that in our group. Even with OER, you're still having to do a lot of work to search through and find those historical narratives you want to teach, because you still have the influence of whoever's writing the text or the material or what they're selecting. So again, that's what you should be doing, going through and finding those stories for yourself, or like Tanya said in chat, talking to your students, getting their perspective, sharing their stories, and seeing what you can learn from one another too, especially in classes that don't get stuck in the 1600s for a couple of weeks like that. More modern classes, we'll call them, I guess.
In my group, Amanda Sullivan, sorry, I'm going to share what you said. She pointed out that sometimes students get something very different out of the readings than we got out of it. And I think just being flexible and letting them guide the discussion, putting I know that we have our learning outcomes and we have to talk about certain things, and there's certain things we want them to get, but letting students tell us their reactions first, and then seeing how we can incorporate what they're getting out of it into our learning outcomes or our learning objectives, and so I really appreciated that she said that, and thought it was worth sharing out, like just hearing how our students are feeling about stuff rather than putting our emotions onto them or our reactions onto them.
Yeah, and decentering the classroom, again, it gets them more engaged. It gives them it shows that their voice matters in the classroom. And again, you're going to end up learning as much as they are when you restructure your class like that. So that's a great idea as well. I think we have time for one more. Anybody else want to share something for 2 minutes? Should be looking at chat more, my apologies.
Well, Paul, one of the things that we had talked about within our group, especially as far as ideas and solutions to help avoid some of these in this class, is to not let ourselves get caught into the trap of just kind of carbon copying our courses and being able to just teach the exact same course the same way. We have to be able to be more flexible in our content, to be able to know who our audience is, which is going to be the students themselves. Because in order for them to feel that inclusion, they first have to be included, and that's going to be finding those connections and making those connections, of finding those backgrounds within the specific types of group that you're going to be working with. And know that each class that you teach, Paula made a good point that sometimes a flipped classroom works really great in one class, an exact same semester, you teach the same class, and it doesn't work in another. It's about knowing how to frame your content, and also how to change your content in order to make sure that the students that you have and the student population you have is actually going to get the information you're trying to get across.
Exactly. And again, that goes back to, like we were saying, building those relationships, again, surveying them, because again, if they trust you, they'll give you honest feedback. They'll say why they don't like something. They're not going to be afraid that you're going to frown at them or something if you don't, if they criticize you. So letting them know that they can disagree with you, that's huge. So, well, excellent. I wish we had another 30 minutes to do this, but we have a few minutes left. And so we'll turn it over to Brandon to summarize everything and lead us to the finish line.
Sure. I feel bad taking away from other people's time. They're brilliant contributions that are much better than my own. I really feel this should have been longer. I wish we had another 20 to 30 minutes. But just to describe some ways, again, I know this is somewhat historically oriented, but I also think you can extract some ways, some insights from, what we're talking about here. These are some ways that I've tried to address this issue. Number one is finding narratives of empowerment from people who dwelled within spheres of subjugation. White supremacy and systems of oppression are often so draconian and intricate and complex that in terms of repressing peoples and individuals, that even things that we would not consider to be victories or successes in everyday life are very important to be celebrated in the historical past. As an example, Kimberly Welch's book Black Litigants in the Antebellum American South, that title is very intentional, because if you look at it, it shouldn't make sense. Black litigants in the antebellum South, Black litigants before the Civil War in the American South, Black individuals appearing in court before the Civil War. And if you know the basics of history, it's the idea that they weren't citizens. How were they appearing in court? If you can go to the next slide, Paul, what Kimberly Welch did is she went to historical courthouses that historians hadn't consulted before. She found sources that some people hadn't even looked at since Reconstruction. You can go to the next slide, Paul. And what she found was that there were Black individuals, freed Blacks and enslaved Blacks, who took their enslavers to court, sued them for breach of contract, and won. I know that sounds completely made up, right? But it's true. So instead of teaching that narrative where it's just slavery, what you're showing is how enslaved persons sort of used the rhetoric and the supposed value system of the South to make these appeal in courts and win. It's absolutely groundbreaking. I mentioned this to historians, they don't believe it. I mentioned to students, they don't believe it. But we look at some of these sources and it's absolutely amazing. Paul, if you can go to the next slide, please. You can adopt a transnational approach when exploring damage. We always talk about the civil rights movement in the 1950s and the 1960s. But if you use a transnational approach, what you can realize is that nations in Africa, as they were becoming independent, 1940s, 50s, 1960 was the year of Africa. The United States during the Cold War is arguing to these African nations that democracy is the best system of government that you should adopt. But what they're doing is they're paying attention to what's going on in America in the 1950s and the 1960s. They're seeing German shepherds being mauling high school students, fire hoses being turned on people. They're seeing lynchings, right? And if you go to the next slide, Paul, one of the very first subjects for discussion at the first meeting of the Organization of African Unity was the harsh treatment of civil rights protesters in Birmingham. All right. So this sort of fights against that notion that developing nations were somehow bodied by the United States and that they didn't have a voice. They did, in fact, have a voice. And Mary Dudziak shows that in Cold War civil rights. And if you can go to the next thing, Paul, and I think this will be my final contribution, Use the Power biography to confront damage-centered narratives. That book on the right is absolutely amazing. Sarah Baartman and the Hottentot Venus. You can see it's called a ghost story. Why is it called a ghost story? Well, if we just look at the historical records that are available, it just assumes that Sarah Baartman was a woman who was exploited by the imperialist European male gaze. But if you start to piece together disparate records and question why the records are where they are, you can actually position her as someone who indeed was in a system of exploitation, but also exacted agency. And as the authors argue, was an early modern global feminist, right? So here's a person who exists in the romanticized mind and the European consciousness, and this book absolutely flips that perception on its head. So I sort of, went through this pretty quickly. That's just, and I think the notion to conclude on this is all a work in progress. The people who contributed here had amazing insights, and I feel terrible saying like, hey, these are some things that I've done. It's a work in progress and we don't have all the answers. I think the sort of central contribution here is just identifying the problem. And, you know, the insights that you've all provided here today have generated more things for me to think about. I didn't know if you had any final words, Paul. I know it's 11.
Nope, it just turned 11 o'clock and that was a great ending. So we will say thank you for showing up. Let us know if you have any questions, want to talk about anything more. Otherwise, everyone have a great morning.
Thanks, everyone.